This work was a cooperative work done by three of us at Cornell University and USDA ARS at Geneva. Myself, Terence Robinson, Gennaro Fazio, who's from USDA, and Lai-Liang Cheng, who is from Cornell University at Ithaca. The work was done as a part of the national US rootstock project called Root to Fruit. The title of this presentation is that rootstock affects fruit nutrient profile and bitter pit incidence of apple. We have previously reported that rootstock genotype has a significant influence on the nutrient profile of the tissue of the fruit itself. In a previous study we published in 2019, we also showed that bitter pit incidence varied significantly among rootstock genotypes, and it was related to the fruit nutrient level of the bulk pulp of the fruit. This figure from our publication in 2019 shows that on the x-axis, the ratio of potassium to calcium in 2015 was related to bitter pit incidence. And from that data, we have identified a target potassium to calcium ratio of less than 25 to achieve less than 5% bitter pit. And that is on the lower left-hand corner of this slide. So if you have a potassium to calcium ratio of 25, you get about 5% bitter pit from this data. In this report, we're reporting on two other trials that we have been conducting for several years, where we are looking at a broader group of rootstock genotypes. The first trial was planted in northern New York near the Canadian border in 2008. The cyan variety was Honeycrisp, and there were 41 rootstock genotypes in this trial with 5 replications and 2 trees per replication. We evaluated bitter pit in 2016 and 2018. And in 2018, we also evaluated fruit peel mineral concentrations. I want to emphasize that starting in 2017 and then 18 and beyond, we have stopped looking at the bulk flesh mineral content and have focused our evaluations on just the mineral concentration in the fruit peel itself. The second experiment we'll report on today was planted in 2007 at Geneva, where at Cornell University. Again, the cyan variety was Honeycrisp. It has fewer rootstock genotypes. It has 19. There were 5 reps, 1 tree per rep, and we had bitter pit evaluations in 2017 through 2020. In this trial, we looked at cumulative yield as affected by rootstock, and then calculated from the bitter pit incidence data and fruit size an economic value of the crop for each rootstock of bitter pit free fruit. First, let me focus on the Northern New York trial. On these two graphs are the data from 2016 on the top and 2018 on the bottom. On the x-axis are the 41 different rootstock genotypes, and I will just briefly go over them, although the numbers are small. Starting on the left-hand side is B9. Then there's about 15 rootstock genotypes from Geneva that are not released, that are just elite selections. They're titled CG and then a number. Then are a series of released Geneva rootstocks, starting with G11 and then going on to several others in numeric order, followed by other rootstocks from around the world, M7, M9, the NIC29 clone, MM111, Ottawa 3, P22, and Vineland 1. The two graphs have the rootstocks in the same order. In 2016, the upper graph, the incidence of bitter pit was substantially higher than in 2018, even though they had similar crop loads, indicating a strong environmental component to bitter pit incidence. It's interesting that in 2016, the rootstock with the highest bitter pit was a Geneva elite selection 6879. If you compare that rootstock in 2018, it also had relatively high bitter pit, but another rootstock, M7, surpassed it with a higher bitter pit in 2018. In general, when you compare the 2 years, stocks that had low bitter pit incidence in 2016 also had low or no bitter pit in 2018. However, not all stocks that had high bitter pit in 2016 also had high bitter pit in 2018, which is a difficulty in comparing the effect of rootstock over several years. In this particular year of 2018, we also measured fruit mineral content of the peel. I present only the data showing the ratio between potassium and calcium, which is in the orange bars. I have kept from 2018 the blue bars, which indicates bitter pit incidence. And the first point I want to make about the data from 2018 is that the overall potassium to calcium ratio was relatively low. It was every rootstock had less than the ratio of 25, which we've previously identified as a threshold for less than 5% bitter pit. Nevertheless, even though the potassium to calcium ratios were low, there were some stocks that had relatively high bitter pit. M7 had about 16%, and 6879 had about 12%, and Geneva 6001 had about 11%. But nevertheless, the relatively low potassium to calcium ratio was correlated with relatively low bitter pit on almost all rootstocks. But when we plotted the data for all rootstocks against potassium to calcium ratio, the correlation was relatively poor, accounting for only 8% of the variation. The R-square was only 8%. This is a little bit in contrast with data from other years and data we will see in other presentations in this symposium. And it probably could relate to the fact that this particular experiment was run in a cool climate, and bitter pit generally is less in cooler climates. Second, I'd like to focus a little bit on the Geneva rootstock trial. It had fewer rootstocks, but in 2019, we measured bitter pit incidence in these rootstocks, and it ranged considerably, and it was strongly affected by rootstock. If you look on this chart on the left, B9 had the lowest bitter pit incidence, about 3%. Two other rootstocks were also relatively low, around that same rate of G65 and Geneva 214. And in this year, in this experiment, M9 was also relatively low in bitter pit. In contrast, Geneva 6210 had relatively high bitter pit of 40%. M7 also had high percent bitter pit, and Geneva 814 had high percent bitter pit, as well as Budogoski 118. Most of the other rootstocks were intermediate. When we compared in this experiment the cumulative yield over 14 years and used that bitter pit incidence to calculate bitter pit free fruit, we came up with the results in this chart. The main point with this chart is to look at the difference between cumulative yield and bitter pit free yield. So with B9, which had a relatively low percent bitter pit, it was very similar, around 580 total metric tons per hectare. With other rootstocks, it had much higher bitter pit incidence. For example, Geneva 210, it had much higher yield than B9 overall, but because it was high bitter pit incidence, the bitter pit free yield was not significantly different, but it was certainly numerically lower than B9. Other rootstocks like M7, although had similar yields to B9, when you removed the bitter pit fruit, then the cumulative yield was significantly lower than B9, with many of the other rootstocks in between. However, some rootstocks had very, very high yield, like Geneva 935, modest amounts of bitter pit, so that the bitter pit free yield was significantly greater than B9. Also, this Geneva 214 didn't have quite as high a yield, although not significantly different than 935, but the bitter pit free yield was essentially the same. When we converted the bitter pit free yield with fruit size data to economic value, we came up with this data of crop value per hectare over 14 years. Now, these numbers are relatively high, and I want to explain it's because the price of Honeycrisp in the United States is relatively high. It's the highest price variety we grow. Many growers plant B9 because they believe, and it's true, it has low bitter pit percentage. But because it has only modest yields, when you convert that to dollars, the yield is not, or the cumulative crop value is not as high as with some other rootstocks. I first want to compare B9 with G65. They both had low bitter pit incidence, but the yield of B9 was higher than G65. Hence, the cumulative crop value was much higher, somewhere almost $900,000 per hectare over 14 years. But two other rootstocks in particular, and then several others in addition, had substantially higher yield with only modest amounts of bitter pit. I first point out Geneva 214, which is a rootstock that's slightly more vigorous than M9 and certainly more vigorous than B9, but it had some of the highest yield and only modest amounts of bitter pit. Therefore, its cumulative crop value was about 1.3 million. Similarly, Geneva 935 had a similar crop value, as well as Geneva 11 and Geneva 30. Those four rootstocks had significantly greater crop value than did B9. The difference was substantial, somewhere between around $400,000 to a little more than $400,000 cumulative. When divided by 14 years is, $30,000 or $40,000 a year per hectare, an increased crop value simply from the rootstock choice. Hence, rootstock choice at the time of planting has very large economic consequences, both in the percent bitter pit, but also in the total yield of bitter pit free fruit. I want to end this slide by just showing the Geneva 210 data. It had some of the highest yields, but because of relatively high bitter pit incidence, its crop value was no better than B9 or some of the other rootstocks, including M7. This has led us to this dilemma and concern to help growers choose the right rootstock for Honeycrisp. With Honeycrisp, since it's a wheat-growing variety, the goal is to select a rootstock with enough vigor to fill the space in 2 to 3 years, based upon the scion vigor, the soil vigor, and the climate vigor, and that will have high yields of bitter pit-free fruit. Now, because Honeycrisp is a low-vigor scion variety, if B9 is the rootstock chosen, it often does not fill the allotted space. And I show below here a picture of very nice fruitful trees, but with too little canopy between the trees. They did not grow enough to fill the space compared to the picture on the right, which shows a more filled out canopy space. We have shown that bitter pit incidence is greater with more vigorous rootstocks and rootstocks that seem to be efficient in the uptake of potassium and nitrogen. So in our search for improved rootstocks, the best rootstock appears to be those that have sufficient vigor to fill the space, but which also have relatively low potassium uptake. To try to look at this in a commercial sense, we surveyed 265 orchards across Honeycrisp orchards across New York State and evaluated their mineral concentration of the fruit peel in 2020. And we came up with a range of different potassium to calcium ratios. On the chart, those blocks labeled in red had potassium to calcium ratios greater than 27. Those yellow were between 23 and 27, and those that were green were less than 23. And from this, we then suggested that those orchards which had fruit potassium to calcium ratios below 23 were probably not going to have any bitter pit and could be suitable orchards blocks for long-term storage, whereas those in red would probably be very high-risk orchards for bitter pit. And from that data, we also have suggested different fertilization strategy for Honeycrisp orchards, both based on rootstock and on measured potassium to calcium ratio. For orchards in the relatively high potassium to calcium ratio group, greater than 27, we suggest several mitigation strategies to reduce bitter pit and to manage the post-harvest storage of these apples. First, to increase the quantity of calcium in the foliar sprays to achieve at least 5 to 7 pounds of actual calcium per season. We have noticed the relationship between high potassium to calcium ratios and problems when we spray plant growth regulators, particularly Retain and Harvista, and the post-harvest use of Smart Fresh. In terms of fertilization, we would completely eliminate nitrogen applications for blocks that have high potassium to calcium ratios and completely eliminate potassium applications and increase calcium applications to the soil through lime. Now, for orchards that are more moderate in their potassium to calcium ratio, we would do some similar things, but simply reduce nitrogen by 50% and potassium by 50% and increase the quantity of calcium in the foliar spray program. Lastly, I'll just end with this chart, which also shows economic effects. I highlight out of this large rootstock trial, Geneva 41, B9, and M9337. The red bars show the cumulative yield, in this case over 10 years, and the blue bars show bitter pit free yield. When we compare the best yielding blocks, which were Geneva 41, 814, G11, and B10 against B9, the difference in total tons per hectare amounted to about $247,000 per hectare at prices in the US for Honeycrisp. When we compared M9 to the best orchards, which were G41, G11, 814, and B10, the price difference there was $82,500. Thus, this work shows that there's huge economic consequences to the choice of rootstock. And secondly, the management of those rootstocks through fertilization must be considered when looking at how to manage bitter pit. I want to acknowledge that this funding came from a national rootstock project. And I also thank several collaborators that worked with us, Mario Miranda Sasso, Mike Baisdow, and Luis Gonzalez. And thank you for your attention.